The apartment was quiet in the way powerful places often are. Not peaceful, just quiet enough to hide what mattered. Morning light slipped through thin curtains, touching polished furniture that had never been bought with honest money. Voices drifted from another room, low and confident, the kind that assumed privacy as a birthright. This was not a place where secrets were feared. It was a place where secrets were owned. She moved carefully as she always did. Shoes soft against the floor, eyes lowered, presence reduced to function. In rooms like this, being noticed was more dangerous than being invisible. She had learned that early. Maids were not meant to hear conversations, only fragments. Not meaning, not intent. Her job was to clean the evidence of other people's lives, not absorb them. But walls have ears, and silence has memory. The men spoke without urgency. That was what made it frightening. No raised voices, no anger, just planning, measured and patient. Names passed casually like items on a list. Streets were mentioned. Timelines hinted at, never stated. Enough to know something was coming. Not enough to know when or how. She froze, rag still in her hand, heart beating too loud for the room. Invisibility only works if you don't react. She stood there longer than she should have, listening not to words but to the confidence behind them. These were men who believed outcomes were decided. Men who spoke as if Harlem were a chessboard, not a neighborhood full of people. She didn't hear a full plan, she heard certainty. And certainty was always followed by blood. Harlem had taught its residents how to listen. You learned to hear what wasn't said. You noticed which doors stayed open and which ones closed, which names stopped being mentioned. Survival depended on reading absence as clearly as presence. This was how the neighborhood endured pressures that never made newspapers. She finished her work and left without being dismissed. No one noticed. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Vendors calling out prices. Children dodging between adults. Music leaking from windows. Life continuing, unaware that a decision made behind closed doors could fracture it. She walked for blocks before stopping. Every instinct told her to forget what she'd heard. Silence was safer. But the fragments replayed themselves, fitting together in ways she didn't like. Fear followed her like a shadow, heavy and patient. She understood the cost of speaking, and the cost of staying quiet felt worse. There was only one name that mattered now, one man whose awareness could change what was coming. Bumpy Johnson did not rule Harlem through volume or spectacle. He ruled it by understanding pressure. He watched patterns. He listened longer than others. He believed information revealed itself quietly if you waited. Everyone knew this. His name carried weight because it meant balance, restraint, and a promise that chaos would never be random. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and unfinished. She didn't offer conclusions. She offered pieces, a tone, a sense that something was being arranged without Harlem's consent. It was not a confession. It was a warning, fragile and incomplete, carried by trust rather than proof. Bumpy listened without interrupting. He asked no questions that would force her deeper into danger. He understood immediately what kind of message this was. Not a map, not a schedule, a signal. The maid left the same way she arrived. Unseen, unthanked, alive. Harlem did not change that day, not yet. But something had shifted. A quiet adjustment, barely noticeable. The city was listening now, even if it didn't know why. The warning settled into the streets, waiting for consequences to reveal themselves slowly, in time, soon, inevitably together. Always. Listening. Harlem did not feel like a place waiting for trouble at all. It breathed in a steady rhythm, mornings opening shop gates, Radios humming jazz from yesterday, sidewalks already knowing which feet would pass them. Bars wiped down counters before noon. Runners folded slips with quiet pride. Street corners held court like they always had. This was a neighborhood trained to recognize pressure and release, to sense when to move and when to stay still. The calm was earned, reinforced by memory, not innocence. Every face carried history. Every block remembered a lesson paid for long ago. This was not peace by accident. It was peace maintained daily through understanding and restraint, and the shared agreement that survival depended on balance alone, always. Bumpy Johnson fit into this rhythm the way a cornerstone fits into a building, rarely noticed, but holding everything in place. He was called many things by outsiders, none of them accurate enough. He did not chase chaos or applause. His value was consistency. Violence existed because it always does, but under rules everyone understood. Lines were drawn and rarely crossed because memory kept them bright. People remembered what happened the last time someone forgot the boundaries. Bumpy didn't threaten often because he didn't need to. His authority came from recall, from knowing which blood had already been spilled and why. He made sure it never felt wasted. The streets trusted that kind of order, even if they never said his name aloud again today. Around him, the machinery of Harlem moved smoothly. Black power brokers, Italian mob figures, numbers men, and corrupt officials all shared a quiet understanding. No one loved one another, but profit prefers predictability. Meetings happened behind curtains and inside cars parked too long. Deals were struck without handshakes, enforced by the knowledge that disruption attracted attention, and attention brought consequences. Harlem survived by managing its exposure, by knowing when to look invisible. Music helped with that. It softened the edges, made nights feel endless and safe. Saxophones cried and laughed at the same time, reminding people that beauty could exist beside danger. Every song carried a warning and a promise together. Life felt durable because it had learned how to bend without breaking, yet still. Still beneath that rhythm sat tension, not fear exactly, but awareness. Everyone knew the calm was conditional. That rules only mattered as long as everyone agreed to follow them. Neighborhoods like this learned not to trust silence too much, because storms did not announce themselves. They gathered quietly, out of sight, in back rooms and over late conversations spoken low. The danger was never the noise, but the confidence that nothing could change. That was when men made mistakes. Believing stability meant safety. Plans formed best in peaceful places, where vigilance relaxed and patterns went unquestioned. Harlem had seen this before. Calm sharpened memory, not erased it. And somewhere beyond the music and routines, someone was deciding the rules no longer applied. The air waited. She woke before the city did, because that was safer. Early hours belonged to workers and ghosts, not to men who asked questions. Her mornings followed a pattern she trusted more than luck. Wash, dress, step outside without being seen. Routine was armor. It made her small, predictable, forgettable. In homes tied to power, that invisibility was survival. She learned where to look and where never to pause. Which rooms carried tension, which ones carried lies. She cleaned what others discarded and carried none of it with her. Or so she believed. Domestic work placed her close to history without permission. She heard arguments dissolve into deals, laughter that came too quickly, silences that lasted too long. Names floated through rooms like smoke. Never addressed to her, never meant for her. She was furniture. Furniture doesn't remember. Furniture doesn't warn. That was the assumption, and it kept her alive for years. But some days the air changed. Some conversations felt heavier, as if they pressed against the walls. She learned to sense when men spoke as if outcomes were already decided. That tone was different. It didn't rush. It waited. The morning she heard too much began like any other. A door left ajar. Voices confident enough to forget her presence. She stood still, not from curiosity but instinct. The fragments came without order. A name she recognized but never said aloud. A street that shouldn't be mentioned so casually. A time hinted at, never fixed. She didn't hear instructions. She heard expectation. That was worse. Plans could fail. Expectations assumed success. Her chest tightened as understanding crept in sideways. This wasn't about money. This was about sending a message that couldn't be ignored. Fear erased routine. Her hands shook. The room felt smaller, louder, even as the voices stayed calm. She focused on breathing quietly, on not existing at all. When the conversation ended, she moved again, slower than before, careful not to betray what she now carried. Leaving that apartment felt different. The hallway seemed longer. The stairs felt exposed. Outside, Harlem continued as if nothing had changed, which made the knowledge heavier. Children laughed. Music played. Life remained unaware of how easily it could be interrupted. Silence followed her home. It sat with her while she tried to eat, while she stared at walls that suddenly felt thin. She understood the rules. People like her survived by knowing when not to speak. Silence protected you from being noticed, but silence also made you complicit. She did not know the whole plan. She did not need to. She knew enough to picture consequences, enough to imagine names turning into funerals, enough to realize that once you hear something like that, sleep never comes the same way again. The decision did not feel brave. It felt urgent and reckless. She weighed the dangers honestly. Speaking could kill her. Staying quiet could kill others. That calculation offered no comfort. There was only timing. Only the question of who might understand incomplete truths without demanding more. There was one man who listened for patterns instead of details, who respected fragments because they often arrived that way. Bumpy Johnson did not require certainty to act. He required signals. When she finally went to him, she carried no proof, only fear shaped into words. She did not embellish. She did not explain what she didn't understand. She offered what she had and hoped it would be enough. She left without knowing whether she had done the right thing. History rarely feels monumental when you're inside it. It feels small, personal, terrifying. She returned to her life changed, knowing she had become something dangerous without ever intending to be. The warning was imperfect. That imperfection would soon test Harlem. Bumpy Johnson listened the way some men breathe, quietly and without display. He did not interrupt, did not lean forward, did not signal urgency. When the maid finished speaking, he let the silence sit between them long enough to feel its weight. Silence was useful. It told people more than questions ever could. He thanked her without ceremony, without promises, because promises created trails. Then he sent her away, not dismissed, but released, understanding that safety sometimes came from being forgotten. He did not react because reaction was what traps expected. Panic exposed priorities. Outrage revealed fear. Bumpy preferred stillness. He carried the fragments she gave him like pieces of a familiar puzzle, not trying to force them together, only letting them rest. Names mattered less than timing. Locations mattered less than behavior. He had lived long enough to know that real threats announce themselves through change, not declarations. Over the next days, he watched Harlem the way a physician watches breathing. He noticed who grew cautious too quickly, who arrived late to meetings they once dominated, who spoke less or spoke too confidently as if rehearsed. Downtown, the patterns echoed. Phones rang unanswered. Couriers doubled routes. Men who usually pressed for advantage suddenly waited. These were not coincidences, they were symptoms. Someone believed the ground was shifting, and belief alone changed movement. Bumpy did nothing that looked like preparation. He walked the same blocks, sat in the same chairs, listened to the same conversations. He let people believe nothing had reached him. That illusion mattered. Power that reacts loudly invites testing. Power that stays quiet invites doubt, and doubt fractures coordination. He allowed uncertainty to spread naturally, without fingerprints. Every ordinary action carried intention precisely because it appeared unremarkable. He never sought confirmation. Confirmation would have required exposure. Instead, he tested assumptions by removing small pressures and watching the response. A delayed favor here, an unanswered message there. Each absence produced information. Men revealed themselves not by what they said, but by what unsettled them. The plot did not need to be named to be mapped. It already existed in the adjustments people made around it. What the Maid brought him did not create urgency. It provided alignment. It matched something he had already sensed but not yet respected. Intuition without evidence was noise. Evidence without context was chaos. Together, they formed clarity. He understood that stopping the plan outright would announce awareness. Redirecting it would collapse it quietly, without confrontation, without heroes. Bumpy's restraint was not mercy. It was efficiency. Violence drew attention, and attention invited intervention from forces that did not care who survived. He preferred outcomes that required no explanation. If the plot dissolved on its own, no one could accuse him of interference. Men would blame one another, or chance or timing. Responsibility would scatter, and with it, momentum. When power stays silent, it is rarely absent. It is listening, measuring, adjusting. By the time others sensed resistance, the conditions that made their plan possible would already be gone. That was how Bumpy operated. He did not wait for danger to arrive. He watched it lose confidence. Somewhere, the men who believed they were unseen had already begun to feel exposed, though they could not say why. The warning had been read. The response was already underway. Nothing about it looked dramatic. No meetings were canceled, no threats delivered. Yet alignment shifted. Small choices multiplied, doors closed softly, paths narrowed, confidence thinned. What had seemed inevitable began to feel uncertain. That uncertainty would do the work violence never could. By the time anyone realized the plan was failing, failure would already feel personal, internal, and irreversible, without a single confrontation to explain it, or anyone to fight or forgive. Soon. The collapse did not announce itself. There were no sirens, no headlines, no sudden violence to mark the moment. Instead, things simply began to stop working. A meeting arranged weeks in advance dissolved when one man failed to arrive, then another. Phones rang longer than usual. Messages were left unanswered, not out of defiance but hesitation. Each delay felt small, explainable, temporary. Together, they created a sense that something invisible had shifted beneath everyone's feet. Couriers were the first to disappear, not permanently, just long enough to interrupt rhythm. Routes changed without explanation. Deliveries arrived late or not at all. Men who relied on precision grew irritated, then cautious. Precision had always been protection. Without it, every step felt exposed. Someone suggested postponing. Someone else agreed too quickly. Momentum thinned, stretched, lost its shape. Plans that depended on confidence began to feel fragile. Pressure followed, quiet and well-timed. Police attention surfaced where it rarely lingered, brief but disruptive. A patrol car parked too long. A question asked twice. Nothing illegal enough to challenge, nothing friendly enough to ignore. It created the impression of awareness, whether real or not. That was enough. No one could tell who had spoken, or if anyone had. Suspicion turned inward. Trust, already scarce, eroded rapidly. Allies began to withdraw without explanation. Favors went unreturned. Invitations stalled. Men who once pushed for urgency now advised patience. Each retreat seemed personal, motivated by self-preservation rather than strategy. That made it contagious. No one wanted to be the last one moving forward when everyone else was stepping back. The plan did not encounter resistance. It encountered absence, and absence was harder to confront. Harlem did not erupt. It froze. Conversation shortened. Laughter softened. People noticed pauses where there had been certainty. The neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for a sound that never came. Safety did not announce itself either. It arrived as silence, unfamiliar and unsettling. The streets sensed it before understanding it. Something dangerous had passed without touching them. Inside the collapsing circle, confusion hardened into fear. Men searched for explanations and found none that satisfied. They reviewed details, retraced conversations, questioned timing. Every answer led to more doubt. The terrifying part was the lack of evidence. There was nothing to fight, no enemy to name. The plan hadn't failed because of interference. It had suffocated under its own uncertainty. This was the victory no one could describe. No gunshots marked it. No bodies confirmed it. Without proof of opposition, blame scattered. Each man suspected another of weakness, of betrayal, of speaking too freely. The pressure turned inward, consuming coordination. Momentum reversed quietly, like a tide slipping away before anyone noticed the shoreline had changed. Harlem noticed the silence before it noticed the safety. People felt lighter without understanding why. Certain faces stopped appearing. Certain tensions dissolved. Life resumed its rhythm, but with a subtle difference, as if danger had been edited out rather than defeated. The warning had not caused violence. It had prevented it by redirecting force back toward its source. By the time anyone realized the moment had passed, there was nothing left to confront. Only the uneasy knowledge that something powerful had moved, unseen, and decided the outcome without ever stepping into the light. No one celebrated, because celebration invites questions. The city simply adjusted the way it always had. What mattered was not who lost, but that the loss left no scar. That was the lesson Harlem absorbed instinctively. Power had shifted without spectacle, and that made it more permanent. Somewhere, men who believed themselves architects of fate were left staring at empty calendars, realizing too late that timing, once lost, never returns. The silence remained, thick and instructive entirely. Harlem woke up without an announcement. No bells rang, no papers carried explanations. The streets simply felt different. Like a room, after an argument has ended, but before anyone speaks again. Shop owners unlocked doors with a little less caution. Conversations resumed without glancing over shoulders. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet something heavy was gone. People noticed it in fragments. A familiar tension missing from a block. A bar quieter, not from fear but ease. Men who once occupied corners with loud certainty were absent, their usual places filled by ordinary movement. Others stepped forward subtly, not claiming space, just inhabiting it naturally. Authority rearranged itself without ceremony. Rumors traveled the way they always had, sideways and unfinished. Someone said a meeting never happened. Someone else heard a name was no longer welcome. Details changed with each retelling, but the feeling stayed consistent. Whatever danger had been expected never arrived. That absence became the story. Harlem understood absence. It had survived on reading what wasn't there for generations. Children played longer outside. Music lingered instead of cutting off early. Night felt less compressed. People didn't celebrate because celebration suggests relief, and relief invites memory. Instead, they adjusted. Adjustment was how the neighborhood honored survival. You moved forward without asking too many questions, trusting that if you were meant to know more, you would. Some men stopped being dangerous overnight, not because they had changed, but because whatever gave them leverage was gone. Their voices carried less weight. Their stares lingered nowhere. Power had moved away from them quietly, leaving behind only reputation without teeth. Others gained influence without announcing it, simply by being present when it mattered. People noticed who returned calls, who didn't rush, who seemed unbothered. Control revealed itself through calm. Bumpy Johnson did nothing to mark the shift. He did not claim credit. He did not alter his routines. That restraint fed the legend more than any display could have. Harlem respected men who let outcomes speak. The city understood that real authority didn't require reminders. It revealed itself through stability, through the absence of chaos. People began to speak his name a little softer, with recognition rather than fear. The night Harlem felt different was not one night, but several, blending together. The change settled gradually, like weather patterns adjusting. By the time anyone tried to pinpoint when it happened, it had already become normal. That was how the city knew it was real. Sudden changes invite suspicion. Gradual ones become truth. Memory carried it forward. Older residents felt it strongest, comparing it to other moments when violence had been narrowly avoided. Younger ones sensed it without context, accepting the calm as natural. Both groups understood something important had passed without explanation. Harlem had been spared again by forces operating quietly in its favor. This was how legends formed here. Not through headlines or speeches, but through collective intuition. The city remembered feelings more than facts. It remembered nights that ended safely when they shouldn't have. It remembered mornings that arrived intact. In that remembering, Bumpy's presence grew larger, less defined, more symbolic. He became associated not with what happened, but with what didn't, and that distinction mattered. The city followed the shift instinctively, learning once more that power rarely announces itself. It moves, and everything else moves with it. Later, storytellers would struggle to explain it, because nothing visible proved it occurred. But those who lived there carried the knowledge quietly, passing it through tone and caution. Harlem didn't need evidence. It needed continuity. And in that preserved continuity, the night lingered, unnamed and intact, shaping how the city trusted silence more than noise. That understanding became habit, protection, and memory, shared without instruction, explanation, or permission between generations quietly. The story never entered official memory because official memory requires noise. Reports need victims, witnesses need statements, headlines need spectacle. This moment offered none of that. There were no bodies, no arrests, no scenes to photograph. Nothing broke loudly enough to demand ink. Survival rarely announces itself, and Harlem understood that what saved it that week left nothing concrete behind. Silence did the work, and silence leaves no paperwork. People searched later for documentation and found only gaps. Police files skipped over the days entirely. Newspapers mentioned unrelated crimes, as if history had blinked and looked away. That absence was not accidental. When power resolves things quietly, everyone involved has reason to keep it that way. Writing creates responsibility. Responsibility creates vulnerability. So the city let the moment pass undocumented, protected by its own discretion. The Maid vanished from the record by design. Her safety depended on it. People like her survived by becoming forgettable again, returning to routines that erased significance. No one preserved her name, not out of cruelty but respect. To remember her publicly would have placed her back in danger. Her role lived on only in murmured acknowledgments, in careful pauses when the story reached that point. She became a symbol without identity, proof that influence does not require permanence. Bumpy Johnson understood this instinctively. Claiming credit would have undone the outcome. Power that announces itself invites challenge, investigation, revision. He let the city believe what it needed to believe, which was nothing specific. By refusing narrative ownership, he ensured the result could not be contested. History could not interrogate what it could not define. His restraint protected everyone involved, including himself, and allowed the balance to settle without resistance. Legends in Harlem rarely came from spectacle. They formed in the spaces between facts, in the shared understanding that something important had occurred without proof. Stories survived because they could not be disproven. Each retelling softened details and strengthened meaning. Silence became a shield, preserving the lesson without exposing its source. What wasn't written couldn't be used, twisted, or buried. It remained flexible, passed hand to hand like memory. This absence shaped how the moment aged. Without records, it escaped reinterpretation. No one could assign motives or reduce it to a headline. It stayed intact, carried through tone rather than text. That was why it endured. Harlem trusted stories that survived without permission. They felt truer than official accounts, closer to lived experience. The city learned again that survival sometimes requires refusing documentation, choosing continuity over recognition. What remained was not evidence, but alignment. People remembered how the city felt before and after, and that was enough. Memory became a form of protection, a way to pass knowledge without exposing it. This was how power survived in Harlem, by staying undefined. The story lived because it stayed incomplete, resisting capture. It waited to be felt, not studied. And in that waiting, it became legacy, ready to move forward, untouched by explanation. It asked listeners to supply their own understanding, to trust intuition over documentation. That trust bonded generations, teaching caution without fear. Silence became inheritance. In losing names and dates, the meaning sharpened. What remained was a lesson about restraint, timing, and the strength of not being seen. This was why the story endured, unclaimed and protected, moving quietly through Harlem long after the danger passed. It belonged to everyone precisely because no one owned it. That anonymity was the final shield, keeping the past alive by refusing to pin it down. In Harlem, that was how survival stories stayed safe. They were remembered, not recorded, and that made all the difference. Nothing written, nothing lost, nothing used against anyone. That silence carried them forward. Unbroken, untouched, enduring still. Through time, power rarely looks the way stories teach us to expect. It is not always loud or violent or certain of itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as patience, disguised as restraint. In Harlem, this lesson was learned not through bloodshed, but through its absence. The night that never happened became more instructive than any gunfire could have been. The maid's warning was never meant to create a confrontation. It was meant to prevent one. Her fear, incomplete and imperfect, moved through the city like a current beneath the surface. It reached someone who understood that intelligence mattered more than reaction. Bumpy Johnson did not win by striking first. He won by refusing to strike at all. He let time do the work, let pressure collapse inward, let men defeat themselves through hesitation and doubt. Harlem watched and learned, even if it could not explain what it was witnessing. The city understood that control did not come from intimidation alone. It came from predictability, from knowing where lines were drawn and trusting they would hold. That trust returned quietly after the danger passed. Streets felt safer not because violence had been met with violence, but because violence had been denied an opening. This was a different kind of strength, one rarely celebrated. It required confidence without display, authority without announcement. It required believing that silence could be more powerful than force. Bumpy embodied that belief. He never needed to prove his reach. The fact that nothing happened was proof enough. In a world that expected explosions, restraint felt almost supernatural. The city carried the lesson forward. Older residents spoke of it without details. Younger ones absorbed it as atmosphere. Harlem learned that survival did not always mean fighting back. Sometimes it meant refusing to play at all. The neighborhood remembered how calm could be weaponized, how patience could starve danger of momentum. That understanding shaped how power was recognized and respected long after the moment passed. History did not record this night because history often looks for spectacle, but memory preserved it because memory values feeling over fact. Harlem remembered how it felt to wake up unchanged when change had been promised. It remembered the relief that arrived without explanation. That emotional truth mattered more than documentation. It was enough to know that intelligence had prevailed. Bumpy Johnson's legend grew not because of what he did, but because of what he allowed to disappear. He became associated with stability, with outcomes that required no cleanup. His name carried weight because it suggested that chaos would be managed before it arrived. That reputation endured because it was never tested publicly. Silence protected it. This is the kind of power that doesn't need a gun. It waits, it listens, it understands timing, it recognizes that the quietest decisions often shape the most lives. Harlem didn't need blood to remember this night, it needed continuity. It needed to know that someone was watching patterns, reading signals, and choosing restraint when violence would have been easier. Some legends survive precisely because they were never proven. They live in tone, in caution, in collective memory. This story endured because it asked nothing of history. It existed only to remind those who heard it that real control is invisible, patient, and deeply human. And in Harlem, that understanding was enough to keep the night intact, remembered without being named, carried forward without ever being written down. It lingered as guidance rather than warning, shaping choices quietly. People trusted the calm more after that, believing order could exist without spectacle. The city moved on, but the lesson stayed close, reminding everyone that power used wisely leaves no scars, only space to keep living, breathing, and remembering together, without fear, without proof at last.